Leah Johnson passed her core subjects EC-6 Social Studies test using one of my study guides. She went from failing on her first try to passing with a 266. After I saw her comment, I knew I had to make a video for the new Social Studies 391 exam to help future teachers pass their test. My name's Scott Roselle, and I've helped thousands of teachers pass their core subjects EC-6, and today, I'm going to help you. This video is going to prepare you for the core subjects EC-6 Social Studies subtest. And in this video, we're going to cover three things: what's on the test and how to study for it, the most likely concepts that are going to be on the test, and we're going to look at some authentic practice questions so you see how those concepts are going to appear on the test. There is a lot to cover, so let's get started. Now, the core subjects EC-6 Social Studies consist of 5 areas, and the test creators call them competencies. These 5 competencies are social science instruction, history, geography and culture, economics, and finally, government and citizenship. Now, these might seem simple, but entire college courses are taught on each one of them. Professor Roselle, I could get used to that. Now, I want to highlight competency 2 and 3 because these are the broadest competencies of them all, and it can be especially challenging because they're so broad to understand exactly what you need to study. But don't worry, we've got you covered because we've analyzed the test and I've studied it, and I know what's most likely to come up in each of those competencies. And that's what we're going to cover in this video. Later, we'll look at the most likely concepts to show up as questions in those competencies on the test, so don't worry. But before we get to those 2 big, broad competencies, let's start at the top with social studies instruction. Now, this competency is very straightforward. It's really just how to teach social studies. There are 3 main things to know to get these questions right. The first is how to read charts and tables, specifically bar graphs, scatter plots, pie charts, a population pyramid, or really just a basic table. Another one you need to know is maps, specifically topographical maps, meteorological maps, physical maps, and thematic maps. Now, usually when you're given one of these maps, charts, or graphs, you'll have to look at it, draw a conclusion, and then answer a question. Last, there's pedagogy, and this just means you'll get questions about teaching social studies. Let's take a look at standard K from this competency.
The beginning teacher uses a variety of formal and informal assessments and knowledge of the TExES essential knowledge and skills TEKS to determine students' progress and needs and help plan instruction that addresses the strengths, needs, and interests of all students, including English language learners and students with special needs.
And that's a bureaucratic way to say, be a teacher. So you'll really need to know 3 big things: how to use a pre-assessment to assess prior knowledge, what the difference is between formal and informal assessments, and the difference between formative and summative assessments. Since this is social studies instruction, it's also helpful to know about open-ended assessments and project-based learning, and it's important to know how to align assessments with instruction and what to do with results, meaning how they can be used to effectively impact your instruction. So basically, being a teacher. Now let's get to one of the tricky competencies that I mentioned a second ago. This is the second broadest competency we're going to look at: geography and culture. For the geography section, all the questions really revolve around how does the geography of the Earth affect human behavior. Now, I know I sound just as vague as the test creators right now, so let me narrow it down. Simply put, humans respond to their environments, and they might even move because of it. Let's look at an example. Before 1900, every city founded was located near some sort of water source, whether it be an ocean or a river. Fun fact, in 1870, Galveston was the biggest city in Texas. So why water? Well, humans need fresh water to drink, 1, and 2, water was the most efficient, easiest form of transportation. So they wanted an easy, efficient form of transportation to move goods in and out of the city. Water is just one example of how humans adapted their behavior to respond to their environment. Another thing you need to know is the causes of human migration. Specifically, there are 4 reasons humans move: food and, obviously, water, protection, freedom, and better socioeconomic situations. And if you need to brush up on that, you can watch the rest of this video by subscribing to the study guide using the link below. And finally, because it's geography, you need to know major geographic features and where they are relative in the world. Now, you're watching this video for specifics, so let's get specific. You'll most likely be asked about the Sahara Desert, the Himalayan mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, the Amazon River, the Ganges River, and/or the Mississippi River. In addition to where these features are, you also need to know how they impact the people around them. Free tip, the Appalachian Mountains was a huge geographic barrier during the colonial times, and it impacted human behavior and migration. Overall, the geography competency is really important. It's going to have a lot of questions, so you really want to understand the two-way street between how humans interact with their environment and how the environment shapes human behavior. Are you ready for the broadest category? I keep saying that word broad. It's Lost all meaning. Broad. It's a funny word. Anyway, now the B-roadest category of the test is going to be history because it can really cover anything from the beginning of history until today. And the test makers get a little unfair with the standards of history. Let me show you what I mean. Competency 2, which is history. Item B states that a beginning teacher needs to analyze how individuals, events, and issues shaped the history of Texas, the United States, and even the world. Talk about B-Rod useless. But the good news is I've studied the test and I get to narrow it down for you. Now I'm going to go over some amazing, concrete concepts you really need to know. But to really get the confidence you deserve, subscribe to the study guide because we cover all the topics that you need. So in my experience, I've identified a few key concepts that are highly likely to appear on the test and gives you a nice leg up. The first one is the Columbian Exchange. This refers to the trade that was established when Columbus discovered the New World in 1492. You need to know the goods introduced to the New World from the Old World and the goods introduced from the Old World to the New World. Now the second one's the Northwest Passage. Ironically, it doesn't exist, but just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean it's not important. That's a tough one, huh? The Northwest Passage is the idea that there's this sea-based trade route between North America that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. This would have allowed European powers to quickly and easily establish a sea trade between themselves and China. Finding this was the reason for the exploration in the 1600s. Next, you'll definitely need to know about manifest destiny. This is the idea that the United States' destiny was to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and it fueled Western expansion in the 1840s and the 1850s. It also led to the Mexican-American War, but that's a freebie. The last concept that's really going to help you out is sectionalism. Sectionalism refers to the growing divide between the northern states and the southern states in the United States prior to the Civil War. The key points of sectionalism that you should know is the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Mexican-American War, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, while history is incredibly broad, there's that word again, just knowing these 4 concepts is going to give you a huge leg up on the test. But to really have the confidence for this test and all the other EC through 6 tests, you should really subscribe to a 240 study guide. All right, the 4th section is economics, and I'm gonna nail it for you. It's my favorite one, and luckily the standards here are much more targeted in what it covers. This makes our punch list even more valuable because I'm gonna tell you almost exactly the type of questions that are gonna come up on the test. First up is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost just means that the cost of an event or an action is the next best foregone alternative. Okay, now that sounds really fancy, but opportunity cost really means that the cost of an event or an action is not the amount of money you spend, but rather what else would you have done with that time or with that money. So your next best alternative, your opportunity cost of watching this video, is watching Charlie Bit My Finger.
That's from like 15 years ago.
It's not popular anymore? That's a shame. Next, you'll need to know about scarcity, which just means that in the world we live in, things are not unlimited. So people have to make choices based on their priorities to get what they want, because you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you get what you need. Let's see what the 240 guide has to say about scarcity.
Humans never have enough of what they want. Our wants always exceed our resources. Even the richest man in the world only has 24 hours in a day. This creates scarcity.
The third concept is going to be supply and demand, and it's a really basic economic concept. In short, it says that all economic activity is based primarily on 2 forces. How much of a good exists, the supply of a good, and how much people want that good, the demand of a good. Hence the principle of supply and demand. Generally, when demand goes up, price goes up. And then eventually, the supply of that good will go up. When demand goes down, price will go down, and then the supply of that good will also go down. The fourth and final thing is comparative advantage. Some producers are better at producing a certain good than others. They can either make it more cheaply, more easily, or just plain better. You could say that I have a comparative advantage when it comes to making amazing, awesome, super fantastic study guides that save teachers time and money. We're almost done, don't worry. The next concept we're going to talk about is the monopoly and the oligopoly. A monopoly is where a firm or a business has complete control over a market, and it can set whatever price it wants because you really don't have another option. Similarly, an oligopoly means that there's just a few businesses or firms that compete against each other, and sometimes they collude or they work together to set prices artificially high. One more, and this is the last one I promise. Mercantilism. And man, is this an old one. Mercantilism says that a country's power is measured in how much gold it has. Gold? Yeah, gold. Money isn't even gold-backed anymore, but back in the day, that's what money was. It was gold. Mercantilism was the prevailing economic philosophy for almost 300 years between 1500 and 1800, and it's the philosophy that drove a lot of decisions during the Age of Exploration, like the search for the Northwest Passage, like the Columbian Exchange, like the entire exploration of North America. And those are the biggest concepts to know about economics. But since it's my favorite, and these terms are going to come up, let's see if I can use them all in one example. So when mercantilism was hot, countries wanted gold, so the demand was super high, and thus the opportunity cost of anything else was not getting gold. But gold is pretty scarce, and you gotta be smart about how you get it. Now the Netherlands had such a comparative advantage on naval trade that they basically became a monopoly and got to set prices. See, it's my favorite. And finally, let's look at Competency 5, Government and Citizenship. By this point, it probably doesn't surprise you to hear that there is a lot covered in this competency, but I'm gonna hit the high points so you know exactly what you need to. The first concept of government that we're going to discuss is the Articles of Confederation. This was the first governing document that bound the United States together. It wasn't so great. The Articles created a weak federal government that couldn't respond to the challenges of the new nation. They were eventually replaced by what we have today, which is the Constitution of 1787. The next one is Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine in 1776. Common Sense was a pamphlet that encouraged and rallied support for the American Revolution. Now, the only non-American event on our list is the Magna Carta. It was an agreement between the King of England and the nobles of England. So why is that important? It was the first document in history to limit the power of government. Another thing likely to come up on the test is the New Deal. The New Deal is a series of economic programs passed under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, to help stimulate the American economy during the Great Depression. There are 4 constitutional amendments that are highly likely to be on the test: the 13th, 14th, 15th, and the 19th. The 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments deal specifically with the issues of race in America, and they were ratified after the Civil War. These amendments outlaw slavery throughout the United States and make it illegal to prohibit someone from voting based on race or ethnicity. Now, the 19th Amendment enabled women's suffrage, which is the ability for women to vote. And if you don't understand each of these concepts, use the 240 study guide because we go in depth on all the amendments and all these concepts. And finally, for government, I've got 4 court cases that are likely to be on the test. The first is Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review. Judicial review basically states that the Supreme Court can strike down a law that it deems unconstitutional. The second is the infamous Dred Scott decision, which said that slaves were property and they weren't entitled to the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States. That was overturned after the Civil War. The third is Plessy v. Ferguson, which said that segregation in schools is allowed and constitutional as long as the 2 schools are separate but equal. So the main takeaway is Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. Now the last court case is Brown v. Board of Education, which overruled Plessy v. Ferguson by proclaiming that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional because separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And those are the big things to know in Competency 5. Whew, that's a lot. Now that we've gone over some of the big concepts, let's look at some practice questions to show you how these concepts can appear on the test. If you want more practice questions than we show in the video, just click the link below and you can get the free practice test on 240tutoring.com. Now for the questions. Remember I told you that you're going to have to analyze a chart, graph, or a map? Let's look how that's reflected in a question. Miss Sims wants to demonstrate to her students how the price of gasoline has increased over time. Which of the following graphs would best help Miss Sims demonstrate this concept visually? A bar graph, a pie chart, a line graph, a population pyramid? Since the goal is to see change over time, this choice, a line graph, is our best option. Let's look at one from Geography and Culture. Here's one of those tricky human migration questions. Which of the following best describes why European settlers in California chose to settle near the San Francisco Bay Area? Social Studies exam tip: water's a big deal. One of the most important features when settling a new land is the creation of a harbor so that goods can be shipped in and out without worrying about the big waves of the ocean. So when the first settlers arrived in California, one of their highest priorities was establishing a harbor for trade, and the San Francisco Bay Area is a natural harbor. That means this is the correct answer. Now for the B, road is category. History. Which of the following best describes the primary goal of the first French explorers in North America? Well, France wanted to discover a western sea route to trade with Asia, also known as the Northwest Passage. So Jacques Cartier was the first Frenchman to explore North America. He was sent in 1534 by the commission of the French king to find a western passage to the lucrative markets of Asia. Now, let's look at an economic question. Mr. Scott, hey, that's me. Mr. Scott begins a project among his 4th grade class. He gives the class $20 to purchase pencils and has his students sell them to students who have forgotten their pencils at home. Which of the following economic principles can Mr. Scott's students learn from this project? Mr. Scott is introducing his students to the concept of supply and demand, because his students would supply pencils to the same students that forgot them at home. Now let's look at a government question. Which amendment abolished slavery in America? The 1st, the 13th, the 16th, the 17th? The correct answer is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865 and outlaws the institution of slavery in the United States. Now, that's just a small sliver of practice questions to give you an idea about how these concepts are going to be assessed on the test. Congratulations on finishing the video. If you found it helpful, please give it a like. There's still plenty more to learn. Did you know that our study guide at 240 has over 400 practice questions? If you really want to make sure you're prepared to pass the EC through 6 social studies, take the next step, subscribe to the 240 study guide. It has hours of videos, so you can watch and listen while doing chores. It has test-aligned content, so you know precisely what to study. And it has, as I mentioned earlier, hundreds of practice questions, so you can make sure that you're ready. It has a money-back guarantee, so click the link right below right now to get started.